Good afternoon. I know it's been a long day. We all, on behalf of the panel, we all really appreciate you being here. My name's Jon Harman. I'm a global account manager with Court, and I'd like to invite you to our session, A Leap Forward, Automatic Updates Between DSPs and RMCs. And what I'd like to start with, just very quickly, this is a follow-on. This is the third session in a series a little, and I'd like to speak a little bit to how we actually got here into this session. So we started in Porto. Ronald and I participated, and a few of our DSP friends participated in a session that was focused on technology in the industry, and specifically we talked a lot about this topic, humology, which was this blend of human interaction and technology. How do you design a DSP? What elements of service should be more delivered using technology, and what elements really, truly require face-to-face human interaction? And as a part of that session in Porto, we did an exercise, a group exercise where people broke up and we took elements of service delivery and destination services, and we asked them to discuss in a group and rate. I think it was on a scale of 1 to 10, or it was 1 to 10 on the humology scale. This element of service delivery, is it more toward the human side? So imagine a scale that's 100% human delivered at one end and 100% technology delivered at the other end. In the middle, it's blended. And so they have to take each element of service and decide where it fit exactly on that scale. And so the one striking finding that came out, there was disagreement on something. Maybe there was putting together an orientation tour itinerary, or selecting the properties, or doing a needs analysis. But the one element that came off 100% pure technology at the very end was updating, it was DSP, so it was updating the RMCs. So that was where there was agreement, and that's how we got to the next session in Malta, which was specifically, this time it was just Ronald and I talking specifically about API, actually Ronald talking more because of much stronger tech background, but talking specifically about API and the fact that really the agreement in the room, if you were there among the DSPs and also the RMCs who were present. I know Richard Tucker was at the first session, and he saw the value and the importance of this topic right away. And the agreement was, this is a no-brainer, this needs to get done. And so it was a conversation about what do we have to do to make this happen? How can we move this forward? So as Ronald and I looked towards EuRa this year, it was our genuine and earnest hope that we would be able to meet as a panel and update, especially those of you who were there in Malta, with real progress, not have the same conversation again that, oh, this is a no-brainer and we should do it, gee whiz, why haven't we gotten there? And we do hope that today's panel will give you a little bit of hope that there has been real progress, and that maybe some of the feedback that you all have to share as well today will point in that same direction. So that's really how we arrived here today in Warsaw, where what was a hopeful idea is becoming, or on the verge of becoming, a reality that can have a significant impact on everybody's business. So what I want to do is I'm going to pass it over to Ronald. I do want to pause and just quickly say one of the real joys about this whole process for me is being able to get to know and work with Ronald. When we talk, we should be talking 15 minutes in the session. We end up talking an hour on the phone about everything else, and it's really terrific. So I'll pass it over to my good friend Ronald, and he'll update you on exactly what an API is.
Thank you, Jon.
Sure.
Yeah, so am I on? I am, all right. Because some of you were in the room last time, there was a slightly smaller room actually. It was in the back of the basement in the corner, but we actually had standing room, which was great. We felt it was a good idea to, since the conversation will be about APIs, to get the concept of it out of the way, so everybody is sort of on the same page as to what that means. So starting with a definition, and it's always great when the speaker puts up a slide with text and then starts to read from the slide. So here we go. A set of tools and protocols that enable software applications and websites to exchange data, services, and complex computing resources. So that doesn't help you much. Although there are elements in there that I do think make sense. So the exchanging of information. The previous session talked about that pretty much throughout, about the need for communication, and particularly between the RMC and the DSP, and how that's facilitated, that it's a two-way street. Well, that's actually what technology can help us do, at least to some extent. There's more to what an API can do, and we'll talk about some of that in the context of services in a moment. Another way to think about the API is of it being a contract. And we're all service providers in the room, so think of it as a contract with a service provider. And the service provider can provide data. It could actually provide services with data. The contract might stipulate then what data can be accessed, how frequently it can be accessed, what protocol there is for the security to access the information, and other details that are in the contract. And we're all familiar with this because we all have agreements with our clients as to how we deliver services, so we're comfortable with that sort of notion of a contract. Well, an API is in fact the same thing. Somebody produces a set of rules, and everybody else now knows how to interact with that. We actually used this slide last year to demonstrate sort of a practical example of how APIs then work in real life. This real estate website, the developer that created this sort of came up with the design and the layout to say, well, I want a nice feature image across the top. I have the rent information, I got an address, I got some text, and I want a map. That map developer, or excuse me, that web developer didn't draw that map themselves, right? There's a lot of work to do this. So they went to a mapping service provider and said, hey, if I give you this address, then I want back from you a map. And in the contract with the API service provider, you can now specify that if I submit an address, I want back a map with this sort of boundary and this distance around the location that I specified, and I can actually get a map marker specifically for that address as well. Now, as you click on that web page, in the background, this website communicates with a web server somewhere else, submits this address, the map comes back, and sometimes you see a little spinner when the map loads. Well, that's an API in action. And in fact, unbeknownst to you, you're interacting with APIs constantly. In fact, the entire internet is strung together by APIs. Whether you're on an e-commerce website and you're submitting a credit card payment, or you're actually doing a search to find the article that you're interested in, anytime you pick up this device and load an app, there's an API underneath powering it, in all likelihood. So a final example of an API in action is a little newer, and some of you might be familiar with it, but I want to ask Alexa, what time is it in Tokyo?
The time in Tokyo is 11:33 p.m.
So this is a voice-activated hockey puck called an Echo from Amazon. Simple instruction, right, to find the time, and we all can do this on our phones too, but now we have to type things. I can also ask a question like, Alexa, what is the weather in Paris right now?
In Paris, France, it's 50 degrees with cloudy skies. Tonight, you can look for clouds and showers, with a low of 38 degrees.
Very useful information if you're in Warsaw. Point is, I give a voice instruction to a hockey puck that connects to a web server somewhere that translates this command into, hey, he is asking something about Paris, about the weather, connecting therefore to a database that has this weather information, all powered through the API, and comes back with an answer. Now, these are pretty straightforward instructions. Where this is heading, though, and we might have some chance to talk about it a little bit later, is it's getting actually more into natural language. So I can also say, Alexa, do I need an umbrella tomorrow?
It probably won't rain in Seattle tomorrow. There's only a 13% chance.
So now you know where I live. I couldn't convince Alexa to set up shop in Warsaw because it's actually limited to where it can be used. There's a lot more going on with this device because it actually listens to things, or it's connected to things in the home, so the Internet of Things comes into play. And sort of as a final example of what Alexa can do, I can ask her, Alexa, can you turn off the lights, please? Okay, we faked that a little bit. Thank you, Minnie. But actually, if this was in your home, you could actually do this, because there are light bulbs that are Wi-Fi enabled nowadays. Some of you have probably used them already. And so it starts to connect things together. So if we think about the use of APIs in our industry, this is all about how can we facilitate the data sharing that is necessary, perhaps take away the administrative stuff that doesn't add a ton of value, so we have more time for this two-way communication where we do know there is value, and focus perhaps more on that. And that's, I think, the sort of the setup for what we hope to accomplish with this panel to share a little bit more with you. I think we don't. Well, discussion, there we go.
Yeah, I'll do this, though, because what we'll do now is shift to the panel and let the panel introduce themselves. I think it's actually, if you don't mind me, just give me a second, folks. Probably should have thought to insert that slide. I think we can leave this up for the rest of the time, especially for people who are just arriving. So obviously where we're going here is we enter the assignee's new address in our system, and it's populated at our client system at the same time. That's really the concept, and we can all imagine the time saver. But before we go too far down that path, I'd like to give the panel an opportunity to introduce themselves. If you could please let us know, what your role is at your current employer, what you're doing in the relocation world, and how you came to be on this panel, how this came to be a topic of interest to you. Please, Richard.
Thank you, John. I'm Richard Tucker, one of the supply chain VPs for Cartus. My area particularly is DSP, and my interest is the contribution that I think supply chain can bring to this technical discussion. I think supply chain has quite a unique view of life from the relocation point of view. We see all the moving parts, contract, legal, IT, obviously the supplier experience, the assignee's experience, the service feedback. So I think we have a lot to contribute to the discussion. So, and as you alluded to earlier, John, I've shown a lot of interest in this. Love talking to Ronald, talking to him hours last night, talking to you. So, but with my supply chain hat on, it's about how do we make our IT more relevant to the 21st century and to the expectation that our clients have, and frankly, all the exciting things that we can do with it to make the experience for the customer better. Very
good. Thank you, Richard. And Meredith.
Thanks, John. Hello, everyone. My name is Meredith Kennedy, and I'm a Global Account Director at DwellWorks. And DwellWorks has started talking to some RMCs as one of their service providers in how we can utilize this API technology to really improve the connectivity that we have with our clients. So happy to be here to represent that service provider perspective.
All right. And Brad.
I'm Brad Stevenson, Director of Global Procurement for AIRS. Ron had asked me to join the panel. As margins become more and more tight for our company, it's imperative that we become more efficient, trying to do more with less. And this is a great opportunity for us to be able to electronically send orders and receive information back into our systems that can reduce errors and allow us to concentrate more on quality. Quite simply, be able to handle more files and not have to be in our email so often, so to speak.
Very good. And actually, Ronald, I should give you the opportunity as well, please.
Yeah, founder of Relocation Online. We have a mobile and web platform designed specifically for destination service providers. So our interest, of course, is simple. We have created a system that contains a lot of useful information that somehow needs to make it over to the RMC. And today, a lot of that is sort of repetitive retyping of the information, filling it in a form, or logging into another portal to update that. And there's little value add in that process. We talked about value adds earlier. So looking at what can go automatically to essentially make everybody's lives a little bit easier and get the information faster too, because the technology can do this, as you see here, in real time.
Very good. And just very briefly on the format, I do have a few questions for the panel, then we'd like to turn it over. I'm sure there are some thoughts, maybe some steps some of you have taken in this regard that you'd like to share. So we'd like to hear from everybody here, and we do hope that we'll have time. But one thing I'd like to pick on before we get to the questions, point out what Richard said about supply chain's role. When we talked some last year about why hasn't this happened, APIs everywhere, but somehow it hasn't happened in our space. Why hasn't it happened? I think part of the issue is we've never had a champion. Although as DSPs we may have seen the value, we need a champion on the RMC side who sees the value as well and who will advocate for that. So it's great to hear Richard saying that. And also, Brad brought up a terrific point, which is there's not just benefits for us, there are benefits for the RMCs as well. This really is a win-win. And so with that thought, I'd like to ask, and we've touched on it briefly for all of the panel, including you, Ronald, if you'd like to share, please, why is this particular topic of importance to your company?
I'm happy to start from the DSP perspective. I think this was already touched on a little bit, but there's a lot of reporting that's necessary, and the RMCs that we work for have continued to increase the demands that they have on what they need to get back to their corporate client. I think additionally, we have created more robust standards internally. We have more stakeholders, we're maturing, we have more people who need to know what's going on with the service. And yet we can't afford to take time away from the actual customer experience to devote to administrative work.
Right.
And so we need to find a way to make that efficient so that we can dedicate the time that we need to the ultimate customer experience. And so this is really the most transformational thing that we've found, that we've been able to identify, that's really going to make that leap for us and keep the time efficient so we can do the job that we are all here really to do.
Very good. From the RMC perspective?
Yeah, I think actually Meredith has made one of the points that I wanted to, which is, for me, the end result of all this technology, or one of the key ones, is to free the right people up to be concentrating on what they're very good at, which is the service aspect of the coal face. You know, the amount of work that you and our networks have to do, which is just a complete waste of time, is leading into additional cost that none of us can afford now. But for me, my main interest is to free you up to be able to create that really excellent service level that at the moment we're probably holding you back from. So
Yeah.
that's a key thing for me.
And Brad, you spoke to it. I'm sorry, I was going to say, highlight, it's exciting to hear that there have been conversations about the benefits for heirs going on as well, so.
Right, yeah, definitely. For heirs, I think having the ability to electronically send the order over to the supplier, and for when certain milestones have been completed in the delivery of those services, for that to electronically come back into our system is really the best situation possible. I know that there have been other organizations in the past that have required the use of an independent portal for information to be duplicated from your side into a portal, then for the RMC to pull that information out of the portal into their system, which isn't really an efficient use of time. For you as a supplier, you're duplicating that effort. And the use of electronic API would be quite clearly the best solution possible.
And I'd like to get rid of email.
Right.
That's a different session.
Right, right, because even if we're populating your system, I think there are people on your team who still prefer, they feel like the security of getting the email, which may have the exact same information that, this gives me an idea, that the update has, the automatic update has. Ronald, in the world of API, is it possible that an automatic update would also trigger an email? Not that that's a good thing, Richard.
Well, I think it's more a matter of figuring out what information we need at which time.
Right.
And unfortunately, what we've discovered with all the systems that we have, a lot of us live in our inbox. Right? So we get to the office, we look at our email, and then we decide how our day unfolds. And even with the best intentions, depending on the emails we get, the day may unfold a little differently. But what we're missing at that point is what's really important. What should I be paying my attention to that I'm not measuring because nobody sent me an email about that particular thing? And so I think that the access to data in real time, and not even, I mean, the no-brainer comment, I think, was relevant a year ago. It's still relevant today. It's like, yeah, we absolutely need to do this. I'm more interested to see what's happening next. Like, if we prove as an industry we can actually do that, it gets a lot more interesting from here on, because now we can start tapping into not just a raw data exchange, but measuring the analytics on this and tying it to KPIs, even tying it to the quality seal that we are proud of in this organization, right? Because a lot of these things are also still managed separately in spreadsheets, and so yeah, the possibilities, frankly, are quite endless. And you know, and then we tested something here, right? Like we'll soon get past the data and get into new service ideas, right? There was a discussion earlier. I think it was Simon that was mentioning about, you know, in response to the question about how do we service millennials? Well, we know they tend to be a little bit self-supportive. They think they want that, or that's the best way to go. Let's give them some mechanisms to do that, but that means likely that we need different ways of communicating the information that we have, and so API-enabled services will allow us to do that as well.
And I wasn't being flippant about getting rid of emails, but I mean, I don't like email because I do think there is a far more effective way,
Right, exactly.
a more holistic flow of information than just using email.
Well, yeah, and then when the information's in your email, it's not where you need it, right? It's not where you can reference it. It's not where you can source it. And then, you know, Brad spoke to the point about data, the quality of the data, the quality of information you're getting, because by the time the consultant either updates your coordinator, your file manager, whoever it might be, there are a number of people touching this information by the time it gets to the client. We had a slide that spoke to that last year of the number of people involved, and you're kind of skipping over that. You're getting information hopefully directly from the person who is face-to-face with the assignee, and that's going all the way to the corporate client via your system without anybody interpreting it, translating it, or generating errors. So that's huge. Now, this makes so much sense. It's so obvious. The question on people's minds is, why haven't we done this before? So I'd like anyone in the panel who's open to or has some thoughts on, really, what are the barriers and what are the challenges towards making this happen? Or what are the steps you've taken? I mean, you could combine that, I guess, with the steps you've taken, because, you know, part of the reason Brad and Richard are here is because they have some thoughts to share on what their companies are doing. And so as you step into this, maybe what do you what are some of the things that make it more difficult, despite the obvious benefits? What keeps it from, say, happening overnight, or why haven't we done it already? Any thoughts?
Well, we're actually moving forward with DwellWorks as a pilot in the creation of an API. We've gone through all of our order initiation forms. We're trying to identify specific fields to ensure that we have those fields located in our assignment management tool to be able to choose which pieces of information need to be on DwellWorks radar. Let's say when they would get an order on their side, and be able to identify information back when a milestone would be completed, what type of information are we looking for, and how can we house that within our tool? Which pieces of code need to be updated? So we started about, I'd say, 4 or 5 months ago with DwellWorks, identifying the information that would be required, and we're moving forward with it. I can't tell you when we're going to have that readied, but we fully expect that once we have it fine-tuned, it's going to be what you would call open source. We're going to be providing this information directly to anyone that would like to work with heirs and being connected through an API. And those that want to participate, great. We don't plan at this stage to make it a requirement of working with heirs, but it would certainly make us efficient and you efficient as well.
I know, Richard, you all have taken, thank you, Brad. I know, Richard, you all have taken some steps as well. I don't know how much you're able to talk about it, but
the first
please.
step is analysis.
Right.
Carter's has just celebrated 60 years in the business. Well, you can imagine the journey that we've been through, all our brand iterations, PHH, Coldwell Banker, HFS, Ascendant. We have a system called Atlas. Everybody knows Atlas and loves it, I'm sure. But it's a great system.
Right.
It's a compliant, smart, secure, very effective system. But I guess it's a legacy system.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do we, and we, as we all do, we move a lot of people every year globally across multiple offices. We have, approaching 3,000 staff in the company. That system is there every day.
Right.
Cooking away, feeding everything. Our clients like it. So how do we face the facts of now taking that legacy system and doing something else with it? Do you polish something which works well but probably needs some really different thinking? Do we start doing things as Brad is? We certainly are looking at APIs in that respect. But I think it starts with will, it starts with the right analysis.
Right.
And frankly, a crystal ball, because we're talking about policy changes, different demographics in terms of age, different levels of budget, all sorts of different pressures that you've got to build that system into that system analysis now. So,
right.
But it starts with the will, and certainly it's there with our leadership.
And I appreciate you sharing about, because I think for those from a DSP working in a much smaller organization, most of us, we can make things happen pretty quickly. We have a lot more control. Imagine how daunting it is to undertake the task of making changes to the system at heirs or to Cartus, handling those thousands and thousands of files, the number of stakeholders who are involved. It's not an easy decision. So it's exciting to hear that the conversation's taking place, though. And one thing, when this topic came up in the past, because a lot of us have been talking about this for a while, people were using the wrong language. They weren't using the language of API. They were talking about interface or and so some people may still have these lingering questions about security. So Ronald, would you just quickly put those to rest? Because anybody who was in the data session yesterday might be wondering about the exchange of data, how API impacts that. I'm sorry, I'm speaking to a broad audience, to say both. But Ronald, please, if you can speak to that briefly.
Yeah, so the APIs have made our life a lot easier, because in the past it was indeed about systems integration, and that sounds complex and scary, and actually typically was also a roadblock for people to say, well, that's a security issue, right? And therefore it didn't get done. APIs have sort of standardized the way web developers, software developers can access the data, because there's this contract that defines how it's done and what the security protocols are. What was obvious from the EU GDPR data session is that the data flow is already taking place. It doesn't really matter how it takes place in order to be compliant with the requirements under the privacy and the data protection laws. It's happening. What the benefit is of the API, on the other hand, is that all that information is automatically encrypted. I mean, it should be. So proper API design means that any transfer, machine-to-machine transfer is encrypted. So you get actually some security benefits right out of the gate. And so what used to be perhaps an impediment or a reason not to do it, frankly now is an additional motivator to do it. And I think the issue around privacy data law also will force us to think about the data that we're sharing and build that into the design of the API. And actually that might lead to some other conversations internally that I'm sure the RMCs must be having too. Like, okay, well, we've got all this data, but what do we really need to know where we are in the service? And do we need to build an API that captures everything, or do we focus on maybe some key milestones that are enough for us to make decisions about? So I think that the conversation starts to change a little bit because you now have to think about a different design for communication.
Yeah.
Well, and, I'm sorry, please.
I was going to say, Ronald, I think that's one of the greatest benefits that we've found as we've started working with the RMCs on this, is that we do want to take this opportunity to kind of take a step backward and say, okay, through the years you've added this, and we've added this, and you've added this, and we've added this, and now we have 472,000
Fields.
fields in our system that we enter twice, once in our system and once in your system. So not just let's only enter it half as many times, but how about what's actually still important to you and what's actually still important to us, and are we giving that to you at the right time, in the right way, and are the right people within your organization and our organization getting access to it? Let's really take a smart approach. If we're going to invest in the IT resource to build something, let's build it according to the process rather than formulate the process according to the technology.
Yeah, it speaks to one of the questions I have, which are maybe what are some other benefits other than the obvious? I mean, the big obvious benefit is cost and time saving, and then there's the whole question of data, the accuracy of data. But security is an added benefit, and there is an opportunity here to be more efficient, to find out what information do we really need to be sharing, which does tie back to the security question, because if you're not familiar, one of the things I learned yesterday, the new regulations, you're really only allowed to share information that's relevant, and we're only allowed to keep, as DSPs, information that's relevant to the service that we're going to provide. So it seems to me as if with API, and correct me if I'm wrong, it'll be much easier to go through and tick the fields that will be sent to a DSP or an immigration provider or a household goods moving company, choose the information that they need to know and release that as a part of an authorization, and get away from, sometimes people are still sending a PDF form, or there are different vehicles for doing that. But is that the way it would work?
Yeah, and I think
that's my guess.
Yes, and some level of standardization as well,
Right.
Because because the contract now defines how it's done, and of course the SLA agreements already talk about reporting requirements too. But it would be easy if, let's say, because nobody really knows what these GDPR rules are going to say, because they're still, practically inventing them, even though they're going to be in effect next May. But if there is a change, then you potentially have an opportunity now easily through the API to address that. And make a correction, republish the documentation in the contract, and the whole supply chain is potentially immediately compliant now with that change that you made. So yeah, there's some interesting benefits down the road.
Absolutely. Well, and that speaks, I do want to come back to the what's next and what happens beyond what we can all imagine. But before we turn it over to the audience for questions, I just want to ask the panel, I know you've put a lot of thought into this, are there any other thoughts or points that you'd like to share before we turn it over to the audience, the question on this subject, what it means for your company, benefits, anything at all?
I think one of the benefits that you might not recognize right away, but when you think about it, it's so obvious, is that the people who actually deliver the service in your company, we don't hire people to do data entry.
Right.
We hire people who are customer focused. And so if we're able to take some of the less appealing parts of their job away from them, and I'm talking about the consultants on the ground as well as the employees in the office, then you have happier people working for you, and that makes everything better. That makes the service to the customer on the ground better. That makes the communication to the RMC and your clients better. That makes the morale in the office better.
Right.
I mean, there's an efficiency and a benefit to that maybe can't be quantified as well as some of the other benefits, but I think it's really, really important. And in fact, we've been using APIs internally for about 3 years between our own systems, between Relocation Online, between our built systems, some off-the-shelf systems, because we want to make sure that our consultants in the field are communicating into one system. We might need information in lots of different places, but we want to make that as easy for them as possible so that we are a client of choice for them to work for.
Right.
And I think the RMCs see the same thing. They want to be a client of choice for us DSPs to work for as well. So I think that's important.
Right. All right. Anything else before we? Thoughts, questions from the audience? Anybody at all? Anybody working on API? Anybody using an API internally? Please. Would you like to share, or just sharing the information that you... We're all experts, I see.
Dangerous knowledge.
Yeah.
As our organization, we think it's of great value. I'm with Asian Tigers, and the construct of our own group and the size of having, we'll say, legacy moving services. We have destination services and visa migration. So a number of our partners having those conversations, having connectivity, and our aspirational goal is it's real time from the field
Right.
to our partners.
Right.
And it should be full transparency, and there shouldn't be anything that's hidden away.
Right.
So wherever we can leverage time, resources, and again, the mind's eye, as you'd mentioned, Meredith, of what is important at what point, and what has become the new normal that we've added in some crap and clutter that has made our life more complicated in the communication that we have because we thought it was a value 10 years ago. And it has no value proposition in today's world. So recognizing where we are today with that vision to the future, I can only control today. We have the aspirational goal of where we're going to go to the future, but also being nimble and flexible. And I would look to the audience, and I'm going to make a request. In our industry, I've been in it now for 20 years. I've personally relocated 25 times. That we have an accountability and a responsibility to our community and as our industry. And it actually concerns me of how we work or choose not to work together in this aspirational goal as it relates to APIs and connectivity. Because it's almost like the child's exam time where we put our arm around what we're doing and we hide out. Because it's the technology that we have at Asian Tigers Mobility is ours, and we don't want it to be competitively shared because it's such a differentiator for us. And I think about if every one of us spent $10,000 building an app, if it only is going to cost us $10,000 to do it, why are we doing it 100-fold over? That money could be taken, and we talked about all the charitable things that EuRa does, that we could feed so many children. We could put water in places that doesn't have clean water, but we're so focused on being competitively ego-driven to what we want to do. So how can we break down some of those barriers, whether it's DSP mindset, why are they going to choose Asian Tigers, or why are they going to choose RMC 1 or 2? Because at the end of the day, we all have the same focus of looking after those transferees and the families with the care and attention, the love and generosity to get them to that next location. And we somehow are not mindful of how we could leverage the technology for the betterment of our industry and our next generation. And if we aren't in that position of being open and in communication about it, we're missing such great opportunities that we can leverage amongst ourselves. So if I'm sitting here and I want to be relevant, not as an individual, not as Kay Coot, I want to be relevant as a relocation professional so I can see that there's a profession for the next generation. If we don't choose to make some changes of how we work together as a community, and I could look at EuRa, I could look to Peggy at ERC, and I could look to FIDI and associations to help guide us, what could we do as each of us as individuals to make a difference to take this forward? Because I think if I said my first visit to EuRa, I feel I've replayed conversations about technology and integration. API may not have been the language, but how can we move this forward with a commonality? So we've taken the position with our technology, whether it's apps that have the ability to connect to other relocation operating systems, whether it's sharing the knowledge and skill set of the process, I'd rather share it. So we've taken it outside of Asian Tigers Mobility, and it's actually with another organization, but to enable the sharing of the knowledge rather than me being like the examination holding on to it.
Right.
Because there's so much opportunity.
So that does bring to mind a question, and I don't know if we're prepared to answer it. And Ronald, maybe I'll start with you. Is there something about at least the creation of the API, because the first step is for an RMC to figure out what data fields they need and to write the API. Is there an opportunity for cooperation? I don't want to put anybody on the spot. There may not be an answer. It's a reasonable request. I mean, it makes sense that it could be possible. Does it translate into reality? I mean, in the end, when you look about DSP, we're talking about the same data points, really. We're talking about the same information that needs to be shared. Could there be a shared standard that, or is it really restricted by the fact that Brad's working with his system, Richard's working with his system, and stuck to work with his system? Do you have any, are you able to answer that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think I honestly think it's it starts with the RMCs. Because they control the business too, right? So they authorize it to their supply chain. And to make sense of this, every RMC, and I think Brett pretty much spoke to this already, will end up developing their API, the AIRS API, the Cartus API, whatever it's called, that has a core element to it that applies to whichever service, right? Whether it's temp housing, DS, or house of goods moving, because we all need similar pieces of information in order to start a service. And then separate information for each of these specific segments of the service. And they built this around their own current SLA requirements, their own technical systems that they already have in place, publish it to the network, and then if you look at the landscape of software platforms that are out there, there's probably 5, maybe 6 known DS platforms out there, and then there's a few in-house built,
Right.
and then there's a lot of them that don't necessarily have a system, right?
Right.
But you get the system exchange essentially happening. So it's not like if there's 300 DSPs, we have to do this 300 times. We probably only need to do it 10, 15 times in order to get this to work.
Right.
And so, we talked about this before. This is not a necessarily technical limitation. I mean, if we look in our industry in terms of technology, we don't get taken serious as a technology company if we don't have APIs.
Right.
We consume 20, 30 APIs ourselves within our internal architecture because it's the right thing to do. Like, we have mapping on our system. We don't reinvent that. We go get a mapping API to facilitate that. So I think that's where the standardization comes. I don't think there's an industry-wide standard. I don't think that makes sense. API technology is inexpensive enough that every company can develop one. And then every IT platform is then responsible for, so every DSP will go to their respective IT provider and partner and say, hey, we need to make this happen. This RMC published their API, we want to tap into this. And when they have done that once, it will also be easy to do it for the others because there will be a lot of commonality regardless.
Right. So maybe not an opportunity for a working group, but the steps are clear and simple and
yeah, I think we're past that stage too.
Right.
And it's been hard in past experiences in the industry to come up with some sort of a standard because now it gets political and everybody has a say in it and not effective. Again, and the technology has sort of helped us in that regard.
Right.
To give one illustration and then I'll shut up. Taking Alexa here. So when we met in Malta, the command that I just gave to her is what Amazon calls a skill. Well, there were about 300 at the time. As we're sitting here today, there's over 10,000. So what Amazon, and these are all APIs. So talk about API development and the scale of things, right? So what Amazon said, they opened this up to the development community and basically said, here's the toolkit, here's how you access the voice command, and you go build a database with something, and now you can build a skill around it. And they have now actually put out a contest for their upcoming event in one of their conferences in the fall, because I gave some simple commands, right? So this is very predictable, and that's easy for a software developer to write a command and get an answer back. But they have challenged the universities in the States to come up with a 20-minute natural language conversation about entertainment, sports, or pop culture. Now, we'll see whether they achieve that. But the last question I asked was not a direct command in, hey, what time is it, what's the weather? No, I said, do I need an umbrella? Well, now there's an interpretation being made about, what I actually want back from this thing that it understands. And so we'll see a lot more advances in that. I think the message there for us in the industry is let's get this done, and then let's move on to the sexier, more exciting stuff, because clearly there's a lot more possible for us.
So I think to speak to Kay's point, where there are opportunities for cooperation, we need to take advantage of them. Obviously, I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But before we talk about what's next, and I don't know if you had any ideas, Ronald, but any other questions from the audience or input at all? Okay. Yes?
How do you differentiate the information that would be to a specific associate or a counselor versus a main POC. So as we were looking at building a partner portal, to Brad's point, you may not want to have that user registration and log in to see your dashboards. So how do you differentiate as far as the information to what may be one-on-one who sent that actual referral or file, and how do you differentiate where you might want to see your conversions, sales, or et cetera?
She's looking at me. I'm just going to ricochet this straight to Ronald. Can you answer that one?
If I understand the question correctly, so you'll have some source for this information initially. It might be a website where you do lead generation that then turns into some sort of conversion. All that information ends up in a database somewhere, and now you're making that accessible to third parties, clients, whatever they may be, through the API. So the API documentation specifies who has access to what information. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but when you create the API, you control essentially who gets to see what and how it's segmented.
So if I could just add then from my very, very, very non-technical place, my understanding of what we've been doing is literally coding, okay, here's our 620 fields that we're completing, and here's the 407 that we want to send to heirs, and the rest just sit in our system. They don't actually get access or visibility to our screen. We're literally sending him the data, and we're not sending it, or we're intending to, we're not sending it in a report fashion. The RMC will actually have the data points, which I think is also important when we talked about interface and some other things that have been talked about. It's like, oh, well, maybe I can give them a report, but actually we're going to give them the data that they want to have to then be able to manipulate in whatever way they come up with today, and maybe 3 years from now they choose to manipulate it in a different way. They have full access to that data point, which I think is important also, but only the data that we decided together was important.
All right. One other bit of information, and I'd be interested in your thoughts. I mean, one of the things I think about is say as a DSP, we have information that other providers need once an assignee chooses a property. Well, we know their address. Well, the household goods company is going to need that address for the delivery. The immigration is going to need that as address for the residence permit. So my initial thought is that's once we populate our system, your system has populated that information, it's fed automatically. There is this little asterisk in my brain saying, with the new GDRP, do we have permission to release that information to the mover? And I guess we could get it in advance, but that could be another efficiency as well. It's not just saving the DSP's time, it's saving the RMC's time as well, because there's all this information that's mutually useful that is no longer, right now you have this court, the IC at Carter's, the person at Ayers who's sitting there sort of the hub of the wheel, and they have to be, okay, the immigration company has an update, and the DSP has an update, and the cultural training company has an update. But really, this would reduce their workload as well, because the information that's relevant to those other providers would be provided automatically, in theory. So
I think actually the new data regulations could actually force us to be far more economic with data.
With what you share.
It's a painful way of doing it, but I think...
Right, it is, yeah. But there may be an advanced release around that. There may be a way. Hopefully there'll be a way around that. Meredith, you had a thought.
I was just going to say, I think that's where the true value of all of this is going to come, is as an RMC, you don't want one provider on an API. Mm-hmm. You're not going to actually find that efficiency until we're all being connected with you so that you can be sharing that. And frankly, we want to make sure that all of our customers want it like you do, because that's where we're going to find our consistency. In fact, if we only have a couple RMCs who are willing to sign on, then those who aren't, now we almost have kind of two processes going in-house. So I think I don't know if you've officially asked this question, but what's next in my mind is that we do have to continue to have this conversation, to collaborate, to talk together. If we all move there together, we're all going to benefit from that.
Yeah, that is really my last question, unless Ronald, first of all, for the entire panel is, what's next? What can we do as a group to keep this moving forward? I mean, clearly, go back to the slide. It's a no-brainer. This is obvious. It's beneficial to everyone. It's frustrating to Case Point. It's, we've been talking about this for a while. Why does it? Things take time. We all know that. We've experienced it. From idea to reality can take a significant amount of time. We're glad that we're here in this panel. This is a significant step forward than when we were where we were last year. There's actually real action, and we're very excited to see that. And hopefully we'll be here next year with more to share. But in the interim, what is there that we can all do to help keep the conversation moving forward? And please, I don't think the solution is for everybody to send an email to Richard and Brad and say, we want an API, we want to be a part of the API. But does anybody have any thoughts on the subject about what can we do as a group, or what's next as far as the actions we can take, or what's next as far as the potential benefits, or where this technology could take us in the future?
Well, I do think EuRa does continue to play a big part in this, and so certainly from my point of view, I'm extremely happy to continue to be, part of a panel or a group to keep talking about this. Certainly from Carter's point of view, we have to do what we need to do, but I think, we need to keep talking to the Kays of this world and Merediths and, all of you, because as has been said, the API has to be universal. But one thing, and this is not directly related to this necessarily, but a lot of you are doing some fantastic work in terms of developing all sorts of technical abilities to save your time, to create a richer experience for assignees. And we see some fabulous stuff. So do please keep doing that. Don't just wait for us to, so when I say us, I don't want to speak for my panel colleagues necessarily, but do keep innovating, because we will come alongside and we will connect with that. But there is some great ideas out there. So please share those with us, because it's all useful technical stuff that will at some point impact into the API discussion, I think.
Well, I think particularly to that point, it's inevitable, because we see this in every industry, that all of us will have some sort of platform and app, right? And might be built in-house, might be rented. The next question, of course, is, well, what does the assignee experience look like here? Like, we're going to ask them to log into 15 different systems. It might not be a great scenario. So, but on the other hand, we can also not force the service providers on either end of this equation to work in 15 or 20 or 30 systems. So I think this is where the power of the API come in, and we talked about sort of the idea that, hey, well, I now know this address. Well, if there's one thing that transferees tell us constantly, regardless of our good intentions with single point of contact and all of that, is like, everybody asks me the same question over and over again.
Right.
Well, this is where things start to really matter. It has to be shared throughout the supply chain, and then it will likely be that each provider has its core own system. And in some cases, the assignee might access that. In some cases, the assignee might access the system of the RMC and never actually touch the DSP system. But the API powers it in behind it for all the information that needs to be shared. That's a challenge, by the way. Will be an interesting challenge. But if you look at other industries, that's where this is going. And that's, the Alexa model is a good one in that sense, because this is an entire ecosystem. Like I said, in a voice-activated hockey puck, it's crazy what this thing can do already today, and what it will be doing in the future.
Very good. I have to say, yes, sir, please.
The thing that crosses my mind at the moment is, how do we involve the governments? Because we have our developments on, say, integration of these data. But if I look at, for instance, the Immigration Institute in the Netherlands, we have to fill in a form by hand.
I'll take a stab at it. I think
Please, Ronald, thank you.
digitization will happen at the government level too. And I wouldn't be surprised if governments at some point in time will start releasing their APIs for their, to access their services. And so, yeah, filling in forms again, and like we're discussing here that it's not very productive and not adding any value. Governments might not be the first one to do this, although there are actually some countries, and I see Michelle, nodding her head, that Denmark is very advanced. There's certain things you can only do online. And so if it's moved online, it's digitized to the extent that you can now actually prudentially access it, as long as the government releases that capability. But that's what will happen. Again, it's this entire ecosystem, not just here, but indeed to our outside parties, including the government. So we need to be prepared, right? That's the other message here. It's like let us get ready, and then we can capitalize on that down the road.
Right. You'll need the person who can actually write your end of the API when the time comes. So, any other questions or thoughts at all from the audience? All right. And First of all, I want to thank, and I'd like everybody to give a round of applause for Ronald. Let me tell you why before you actually start clapping. Since our first session, he has really championed this cause. I've been along for the ride. He's done a lot of the work. I get to get up here and stand up here and ask the questions, but he's traveled, he's taken meetings, he's spoken to these gentlemen, he helped put together the panel, he organized the sessions, he did the slides, I just spoke to them. So we will all benefit from the efforts that he has made to move this cause forward. So please, a little thank you for Ronald, sincerely. You know, it's one of those things that everybody's out there saying, well, this should happen, and how come this hasn't happened a long time ago? And Ronald actually stood up and did something about it. So thank you, Ronald. And then thank you all for your time. I know it's the end of the day. We appreciate your time and attention. We encourage you, talk to EuRa, talk to your friends at RMCs, talk to each other, and hopefully we'll be back wherever we'll be next year with a panel with another leap forward. Thanks, and have a great evening.